Today, it's a continuation from where we left off. We're looking at this ORM right here, which is Sequelize. It's meant for relational databases. You can see right here with Postgres, MySQL, MariaDB, etc. These databases are all relational databases, which means they store their data in a form of a table. And there are other databases like NoSQL databases, like MongoDB, which stores its data in documents. All right, so we created our database right here. I want to show you something else today. Some people prefer using this Async Await if you're dealing with a synchronized code, but some might prefer to use the .then format. And so this is what I'm going to show you right now. I'm going to delete this database right here. So let me delete that so that we can recreate it. Okay, so instead of using all this right here, I'm going to do away with this. So what you can do is you can say database.authenticate. This will return a promise. And so you can attach a .then right here. And then, of course, at the end, you want to have a .catch. And so this will accept callback functions. And so .catch, there's a callback function right here. If I control error, and then unable to connect to the database. And then we can pass in the error. So let me just copy this and then paste this. Let me put this in quotes. And so this is the statement that we'll see if it fails to connect to the database. But if it does, then of course we're going to have a callback function inside the then. And I'm going to copy this statement right here, which says connection successful. And then I'm going to paste it right. I'm going to log it to the console and then Control V. And then you can see right here. So execution is starting from the top and then going all the way to the end. So I'm going to open down here and then run node index.js. And then if we run this, you can see here it says connection has been established successfully, which is the same that we had. And then we have our database created up here. So we can see our database right here. So this is another way of doing it. Whichever way you prefer, it's all up to you. After we have created our database, we want to be able to create tables in that database. So for us to be able to create tables using an ORM, we have to use what we call a model. And so I'm going to go to the documentation and then model basics. So these models are the essence of Sequelize. A model is an abstraction that represents a table in your database. Okay, so in Sequelize, it is a class that extends model. Models can be defined in two equivalent ways in Sequelize. The first one is calling the Sequelize.define. So our instance of Sequelize, and then we call .define, and then we pass in the model name, the attributes, and then the options. And then the second one is we extend the model and calling init, and then the attributes and options. So I'm not going to be using the second method, which is actually creating a class. I'm not going to be creating any classes. So let's use this Sequelize.define here. So let's see this in action. Our Sequelize instance is called database. So after we have created our Sequelize instance, I'll call the Sequelize instance right here. I'll say .define, and then we can pass in the model name. I'm going to call it user. I'm trying to create a table in the database for users in my application. It could be anything else. It could be customers. It could be for products. It could be for anything else. But for now, let's say user. Singular, and then we can pass in the attributes. So the attributes are going to be an object. So let me put curly brackets right here. So an object, you can see down here the way they did it. The user has got a first name and a last name. Let's just use this right here. I'm going to say down here first name. Of course, I'm using common casing for the attributes. The attributes will then have properties of an object. You want to specify the type of this. So you want to accept certain data types in your database. And so you have to specify it right here. For us to use data types in Sequelize, we have to import it up here. We destructure it from Sequelize. So we can pass in here data types right here. So we're going to use these data types to determine the types of data that we are expecting from the user. So here we can say data types dot, and then you can see the different data types that we have here. So for the first name is going to be a string. So I'll just say string in all uppercase like this. Another property for the first name, we can force the user to provide their first name. Okay, so here we can say allow now, we want that to be false, which means they cannot allow this field to be empty, right? So the way this works is, let me illustrate this. So when we create a model and then we pass it attributes, what that relates to is a table in your database. So a database, we have a table like this. In this case, let's see, in our case, we are creating a model called user right here. So this will be a user's table. Of course, this is capital letter U. So what Sequelize does is when it interacts with the database, it makes this plural. So it becomes user. So the table will be called users. And then this table right here, we have rows and columns. In our case, let's say we have two attributes that we are creating. This is the first name. So it will go into this one. It will be first name right here. That will be a column. And then this will be our automatic ID. There will be some kind of an ID auto-generated for us. And then we might have a last name right here. This is the table that is going to be created in the database. Here we have an attribute which has some properties. And then we can create another attribute down here, which is last name. And again, it will be an object with some properties. The type is really important because you want to restrict the type of data that is allowed in your tables in your database. So data types, this one is going to be a string as well. I want them to provide their last name as well. And so I'll say false right here. But of course, you can provide as many attributes as you want. You might have an email and a password, but for simplicity's sake, we're going to stick to these three right here, which is first name, last name, and then email. So this one will be type. Of course, this will be a string as well. Data types string. Let me say allow now. I want this to be false. You can pass in a unique property and you can set it to true. Yeah, let me go back to the graph right here. So here we are adding an email field. Okay, so this define takes in three arguments. The first one is the model name, and the second one, the attributes, and then we have the options. So the options is an object. I'll pass in another object right here. This is for the options. Let's say you don't want your table to be called users because what Sequelize does, it infers into the model name and it makes this plural, like I said. So this will be a users. Let's say you don't want this to be called users. You can specify it in this options object table name. And then we can give a different name to this one. Let's say you want this to be called employees. So you can say employee like this. You can pass it in that options object. You could also say, okay, timestamps, you want them to be false because by default, timestamps are true. Timestamp, by the way, this is the created at and updated at. So, of course, we don't want to use this. For now, I'll leave it empty. So I'll just say options and then I'll comment this out. And once we are done with this, we can go ahead and do what we call model synchronization so that we can create the table in the database. When you define a model, you are telling Sequelize a few things about its table in the database. However, what if the table actually doesn't even exist in the database? So what if it exists, but it has different columns, less columns, or any other difference? This is where model synchronization comes in. A model can be synchronized with the database by calling model.sync and then option. And so you can see down here, it says, if we created a user model, in our case, we have a user model. I can call it user up here. And we assign it to a variable so that we can use this thing right here. So we can call it user, but you can call it whatever you want. Whatever this is, .sync. And so inside here, after we authenticate and then the connection is successful, then we can create a table. I'm sure it's an asynchronous. So we can say user, which is this user up here, .sync. And then we can pass in some options in here. But for now, we're not passing in any options. If you don't pass in any options, it says this creates the table if it doesn't exist and does nothing if it already exists. In our case, we don't have any table, so this will work right here. But let's say you were trying to update an existing table, then you have to force true or alter true. But in our case, this is going to work. And so after we do this, then we can call the dot then, because this is an asynchronous operation. We can do some catch here for this particular one. And so in here, I'll say console log table created. Here we can console error dot error. Then we can say failed to create the table. For now, let me open this DB. You can see there's nothing here. By the way, you can use this to view your SQLite database in Visual Studio Code. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this and see whether this will synchronize and create our table. Let me clear this and then run this. You can see down here is table created, which is this statement which I passed in here. the table has been created. And so you can see the commands that we run by this statement right here. So what an OIM does is it removes the need. We don't have to manually enter these commands. Let's go to the database and see whether we've created that table or not. So if I double click to open, now you can see we have a users table. It also creates a Sequelize sequence, which keeps track of the ID. And so you can see we have our fields right here. ID, which we did not create, but it automatically creates that. And then we have our first name, our last name, our email. And then we also have created it and updated it, which are timestamps. It also adds the timestamps. And so this is similar to what I was talking about right here. Okay, so yeah, we're done for today. In our next tutorial, we're going to see how we can then create some instances of the models so that we can store some data in this table. I hope this was helpful. If you find the video helpful, you can leave a like, leave a comment. You can also consider subscribing to the channel. I hope to see you in my next tutorial. For now, I'm out. Cheers.